Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Climate Change Adaptation Building Shoreline Resilience webinar. My name is Benjamin John. I'm the Climate Change and Energy Specialist for the Georgian Bay Biosphere, and I'm joined here today with Julia Sutton, owner of Sweet Fern Consulting. And thank you for joining us here today. So we're going to jump right in. At this point in time, I imagine most of us have participated in a Zoom meeting or webinar in the past, but just in case, I want to start out by pointing out a key feature. So there is a question and answer tool, and it can be located usually beside your microphone or your camera button. So if you have a question at any time, I just ask that you please put your question into that tool, as we will be answering questions at the end of the webinar today. I also want to note that we will be recording today's session and uploading it to our YouTube channel, so it will be able to be viewed at a later date. And a link to this video and other resources mentioned in today's presentation will also be circulated. We are going to turn our cameras off during the presentation, so please don't worry if you can't see us. And as we wait for a few more people to join in on the webinar today, I'd like to start by sharing a little bit about the Georgian Bay Biosphere. So we're one of 18 UNESCO World Biospheres found here in Canada, and our region is ecologically unique as we have the largest freshwater archipelago on Earth on the eastern shoreline of Georgian Bay. So the biosphere, it stretches 200 kilometers from the Severn River in the south to the French River in the north, and it was designated back in 2004. As an organization, we are a registered charity with an office located in Parry Sound, and we rely on grants and donations to continue our conservation and education work here. We'd also like to acknowledge the land we're on before we begin. The Georgian Bay Biosphere is situated within the treaty territories of Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850 and the Williams Treaty of 1920, and located on Anishinaabeg territory. Our organization under UNESCO acknowledges the rights of Indigenous peoples in this territory and works towards respectful and reciprocal relationships as we are all caretakers of the land. So in today's webinar, what we're concerned with is climate change adaptation and how we can build shoreline resilience to high water levels on the bay and on our inland lakes and rivers. And Julia has developed an excellent presentation to show some strategies about how this can be done. But before we get into that, I quickly want to go over just what climate change adaptation and resilience is, because it's an important thing to understand to see how these strategies apply. So when we're thinking about responding to climate change, there are these two high-level approaches that we can take, either mitigation and adaptation. And in fact, when we're thinking about tackling climate change as a whole, both mitigation and adaptation are actually needed and necessary. They're two parts, two equal parts to the puzzle. But for today's purposes, we're going to focus on that adaptation piece. So to define them quickly, mitigation is aimed at tackling the causes of climate change and minimizing the possible impacts. So it's looking at reducing the greenhouse gas emissions to reduce the severity of those climate change impacts in the future. And then on the other hand, we have adaptation, which looks at how to reduce the negative effects that climate change has now and in the future. So it involves adjusting to the actual or expected future climatic conditions. So diving into this definition of adaptation a little bit. So by reducing negative impacts from climate change now and in the future, we're accepting that we've already caused irreversible damages to the climate and that some impacts are going to be inevitable. So essentially our past actions are having future consequences. But through adaptation, we can reduce the severity that those impacts affect us. And that's sort of what this timeline you see up here on the screen is attempting to show. Basically, our actions in the past are causing impacts on us now and will in the future, but by adapting, it can be sort of like a form of a protection or a barricade that reduces the extent that those impacts will harm us in some way. Or in other words, it's making us more resilient to those impacts when they happen. So the notion of resilience is very integral to climate change adaptation. By adapting, we become more resilient as it allows us to prepare for and recover from climate change impacts. But in order to build resilience through adaptation, we need to first understand what the threats of climate change are and what our vulnerabilities are. So if we're thinking about climate change impacts, we can ask if they're going to maybe have an environmental threat, a social threat, an economic threat, or maybe a mixture of these. And to determine how vulnerable something is to these impacts, we need to first determine, how sensitive is something to those impacts. The greater sensitivity that something has, the stronger that impact will be felt. And we also need to determine exposure. And similar to sensitivity, the more exposed something is to an impact, the more it will be felt. But again, to reiterate, in order to respond to future changes or impacts, we need to have a sense of what those impacts may be. And to get the sense of what those impacts are and how they relate and cause subsequent impacts even, we can undergo what's called an impact modeling exercise, where we look at how one relates to another. And here we have an example that just starts with, say, increase and extreme temperatures. And in those extreme and increased temperatures, health professionals have noted that vulnerable populations, for example, such as the elderly, will be more sensitive to these extreme and increased temperatures, which will likely lead to increased hospital visits due to heat-related illnesses. But what's important really just to recognize is that these impacts, they all originate with some sort of environmental change that's being caused by climate change. So we can take this modeling one step further and model what the future climate is going to look like. And for our region in particular, in the Eastern Georgian Bay region, future climate models suggest we'll see things such as higher temperatures and more extreme temperatures, more frequent and extreme weather events, increased precipitation, increased heavy rainfall events. But I think the one that a lot of us are interested in and why we're here today is that we can expect to see water levels to continue increasing. And in addition to that, we can also expect to see extreme fluctuations in extreme water levels between highs and low. And these water levels, they can have a number of following impacts that we can begin to think as well if we're undergoing that impact modeling exercise, such as shoreline erosion, which can lead to, say, boathouse or dock damage or other property damage. So we can then ask ourselves, what adaptation actions can we take to make our shorelines more resilient to water levels and high water levels? And I think that's an excellent segue to invite Julia Sutton to speak about shoreline resilience and how we can do just that. So Julia, I'll turn things over to you.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm just getting my screen shared with everybody. All right, here we go. All right. So today I'm going to start by talking about natural shorelines. I want to talk about what natural shorelines provide and how that is relevant to climate change. I do want to get into some of the issues that we're seeing with shoreline issues and habitat loss based on our current landscaping practices. And this is to help us better understand how these actions are actually going to undermine our resilience to climate change. And then I'm going to get into sort of how to go about selecting plants and doing some sort of shoreline restoration or restoration of any natural area. So some of you may have heard the term ribbon of life. So this really refers to the immediate shoreline area. 70% of our land-based animals and 90% of our aquatic animals and plants depend on this area for some aspect of their life cycle. And that's a huge percentage of our wildlife. So we really want to make sure that these areas stay natural and stay intact, because with climate change, as we begin to adapt and as the effects of climate change start to intensify, we need to ensure that they have space as well. So if you picture a natural shoreline, it's not just a couple of different species. There's many different species. There's different heights of vegetation. There are things like leaves, twigs, branches, and they use all parts of this shoreline. They might use it for feeding. They might use it for nesting. Shorelines are also a major travel corridor for wildlife. So these are all things that we need to think about, and all things, something that the shorelines provide to our wildlife. Healthy natural shorelines also help to moderate water temperature. Basically, any sort of natural cover helps to keep water temperatures cooler in the summer. And if we think about it, it's not just trees, but if you have a wetland area, you can think of cattails as your canopy, and other herbaceous species as well. And as water temperature increases with climate change, and it is predicted that water temperatures will increase, we do want to make sure that we have a good amount of natural cover to help try to offset some of these water temperature increases. For example, some of our fish species are cold water. Some of our fish species are warm water, and some are cool water. So we want to make sure that the cold water species still have an ability to survive. So these are species like lake trout and brook trout. I like to refer to shorelines as cost-effective erosion control. The great thing about native plants is that they bend. And often if they break, they repair themselves. And even if they do die, there's still a root ball left in the shoreline. And that provides its own benefits as well in terms of bank stability. When you look at things like, especially like erosion, if you put in things like rocks or maybe a cement retaining wall, not only is it expensive to do, but you often have to bring in machinery to do it. And that has a major impact on the surrounding environment while you construct those. And then the other thing with rocks and any sort of man-made material is they do break and fail over time. And then you have to bring in machinery again to fix it. So it can be very expensive, and it can also cause a lot of destruction over a longer period of time. And we need to also think about, in terms of our shorelines, when you have natural shorelines, it's not just protecting your shorelines from wave action and from ice coming in and out, it's also protecting your shoreline from runoff that is coming from the terrestrial areas towards the waterways. I think probably a lot of people are familiar with the association of healthy natural shorelines with protecting water quality. If you picture a healthy forest and a raindrop falling in that forest, there's lots of different vegetation that raindrop has to get through, and it may not reach the forest floor. And if it reaches the forest floor, there are things like leaves, twigs, branches, and other plants to slow it down. And when that water slows down, that gives it the ability to get absorbed back into the ground. If you picture a raindrop hitting a hard surface like pavement or a rooftop, that water speeds up and it carries whatever is maybe on that surface with it. So it's really important to think about, anytime water hits something hard, it will speed up. And anytime water hits anything rough, it will slow down. So that's really key in thinking about erosion and preventing erosion. And if we look into the science of it, scientific studies have proven that if we do want to maintain water quality, 75% of our shoreline needs to be in a natural state for a minimum of 100 feet. And there was a Levier Lake study done, I'm not familiar with the Georgian Bay one, but in Haliburton, they did the Levier Lake shoreline assessment on many different lakes, and the majority of lakes did not meet that 75%. So a lot of the lake associations are now, with those results, they're able to focus on shoreline naturalization and really try to reach out to their membership to get people to start naturalizing their shorelines, knowing that this is going to be a key factor in protecting water quality as we move forward with climate change. So when we're thinking about our shoreline or natural shoreline area, so there's that the 100 feet or basically a minimum of 100, a minimum of 30 meters. This can really vary depending on what your slope is, what type of soil you use, how you use the land, your hydrology, and your groundwater. With climate change, you know, and we're already seeing it now, we're seeing more frequent severe weather events. We're seeing more intense rainfall and runoff. And this could really have an impact on water quality, and it may also increase the risk of erosion. So the 30 meters is really key to that. And I do want to bring up septic systems, because we often talk about septics as, you know, their own separate system and doing their own job. But septics were designed to work in partnership with natural shorelines. Basically, the job of the septic is to break disease-causing bacteria and waste into 3 basic components, so nitrogen, carbon, and phosphorus. And nitrogen, carbon, and phosphorus are 3 main things that plants need in order to live. So the idea behind septics is that they break that down, then the nitrogen, carbon, and phosphorus leaches out into the environment, and it's relying on there being plants there to uptake those nutrients before it reaches the lake or the river. And that 30 meters that I'm bringing up is based on many different scientific studies, and it really depends on what function you're looking for as to what that recommended buffer size is. So for example, if you're concerned about bank stability, 20 to 30 meters, and again, that depends on what your wave action is like, what your slope is, what your soil is. For aquatic insect populations, 30 meters. For fecal coliforms and E. coli, it's minimum 30 meters. Overall nutrient reduction is greater than 30 meters. We don't often think of sediment as a pollutant, but it can cause negative impacts. When sediment enters watercourses, it can cover up fish habitat and also important habitat for aquatic insects. So for sand, recommended buffer of 3 meters. Sand is a larger particle. Silt is smaller than sand, and then clay is smaller than silt. So for clay, it's 122 meters, which is quite a distance. But overall, they say that 75% removal of sediment if you have a buffer of approximately 30 to 38 meters. And then once you start to think about wildlife habitat, you know, it can really vary depending on what species you're talking about. If you're talking about fish or amphibians, you know, you're looking at 30 meters. Birds, large and small mammals, from 75 to 200 meters. And again, that depends on, you know, what is there, how frequently the property is used, and what type of species it is. So shorelines also healthy shorelines help us build resilience. So with climate change, you know, we've already seen it with things like the emerald ash borer. There are upcoming challenges with new tree pests and tree diseases. So it's important to think beyond maybe just, you know, maybe you only have a few different types of tree species on your property. So it's important to think about planting a variety of species, and then also thinking beyond trees. So really thinking about what shrubs you could plant, or wildflowers or ferns and things like that. Healthy shorelines are also going to play a key role in lake health as climate change intensifies, for the reasons that we just discussed in terms of protecting water quality and protecting from erosion. Invasive species, it can be much harder for an invasive species to get established in an area if there is a healthy natural shoreline. If there's lots of different species, it's easier for them to move into an area where there's not as much vegetation and it's more degraded. So the hope is that the healthier our shorelines, the less impact invasive species are going to have. And basically that buys us more time to notice the invasive species and then hopefully deal with it before it becomes a big issue. So humans really have a major impact on shorelines. And unfortunately, many of our current landscaping practices and trends undermine our shoreline health. The landscaping industry has been a source of many introductions of invasive species. I used to work at a garden center, and the most frequent question that we used to get was, I have a shaded area and I want something that will cover it and cover it very quickly. And the answer was planting something like periwinkle, otherwise known as myrtle. It's the purple flower at the bottom screen there. Something like goutweed, which is the green and white leaf, but also can be a solid green leaf, or false spirea, which is a shrub. And those have been planted throughout the years. They're still available and still recommended. And when I worked on a landscaping team for a season, there wasn't one property that I went to that didn't have one of those species that was just growing into the forest or into other areas. So that's the thing that we need to remember about plants, is you may want them to be located in one spot, put it in one area, but they don't know those boundaries. So they will just grow wherever there is opportunity to grow. Several years ago, there was, the trend of planting ornamental grasses. So that's been, really resulted in a spread of the Miscanthus species grass, which is pictured in the top right there. And then there's some really serious invasions with Japanese knotweed, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with Phragmites australis as well. So those are some of the issues that have come through the landscaping industry. And I want to talk a little bit about a lack of expertise and knowledge pertaining to native plants as well. So even nurseries that claim to be any training, native plants that are sold are cultivars of native species. And this is a really important difference because cultivars are bred by humans. So when that happens, you're not helping to maintain or increase genetic diversity of plants. And we often hear about genetic diversity being important to our wildlife species, and the same goes for our plants as well. In terms of being more resilient to climate change, the more diverse our plant species are, the better. And just one quick example would be we have a common white turtlehead, which is a native shoreline wildflower. And if you went to a garden center, you could find a pink turtlehead, and the tag would say native to Eastern North America. The problem with that is that the pink one is a cultivar. Bees use the native turtlehead as a source of food, but within that food, there's something that gives them some medicine for their digestive systems. So they wouldn't get that same medicine from the cultivar. So these, it gets really complex when we get into these things, but that's why it's so important, if you are going to naturalize and plant native species, that you get a true native species and not a cultivar. And with our climate here in Parry Sound, and then also in Muskoka and areas farther north, garden centers and landscape centers get their plants from large nurseries in southern Ontario. So they do use pesticides, and that includes the neonicotinoid pesticides that we've heard about. Now the Canadian Nursery Landscape Association does say that if, by the time you get the plant home, there shouldn't be any residue left on the plant. But I have seen a situation where that is not the case. So that really undermines my trust that when I get that plant home, it's going to be safe for pollinators. So probably one of the most damaging things we've done to our shorelines is to remove vegetation, put in lawns and put in anchor stones. So this, exactly kind of what's going on in that photo there. Everything that we talked about that a natural shoreline provides is missing there. Now, mowed lawn, yes, it is vegetation, but mowed lawns are called green cement, and they're basically called green cement because when water hits grass, it runs off of it really easily. Grass is very shallow rooted and does not do a good job at preventing erosion, whereas a native plant, its root systems goes much deeper, and it does catch that runoff as it comes off. So some of the reasons, for restoration, basically to help maintain, we need to maintain our natural shoreline functions. Even here in the Parry Sound district, we do have a lot of habitat fragmentation and habitat loss, and a lot of that is due to roads, and then also residential and cottage development. We do have a lot of poor development practices in terms of how we prep building sites and how we replant them. So we really need to start rethinking that, what plants we use, how we clear things. We want to restore to help maintain and improve biodiversity as well, because this will help us in terms of building resilience for climate change. And we talked about invasive species, using native plants and naturalizing areas to help reduce the severity of those introductions, and then species at risk. So we've got the species at risk that are currently at risk, and likely more species that will become at risk as climate change progresses. So we need to make sure that we're supporting them. We have a lot of alarm bells going off. There was a report put out in 2019 that many of our insects could become extinct in as little as 30 years. And that the number one factor leading to that is habitat loss. And that's a really tricky one, because it's really hard to get people to care about insects. But when we think about it, insects support many of our fish and wildlife species, and they also support us through pollination. So 75 to 95% of all flowering plants on Earth require pollination. So this is actually a really serious issue. And we need to, again, just really make sure that we keep habitat going, especially to help address this. So what are some of the barriers and misconceptions around naturalization and native plants? So a big one is landscaping trends. It's very normal and for people to want to design and maintain their spaces as to sort of what's in style or what other people are doing. So if the landscaping industry, which is big business, they set these trends, and then this is how people want to develop their property. So people are influenced by that. Sometimes it comes from a place of authority. So maybe there's a spot that you're developing and the township asks that you plant native plants there. So people they don't often want to plant native plants if they're told that they have to. And it's also because there's this misconception that native plants are boring and they're ugly, and there's not much selection. There's also a real issue with people worried that their property is going to look too wild looking, and thinking, worrying about what the neighbors will think of them, that they're not keeping up, not keeping their property tidy. And then an inability to use your property. So these are all things that prevent people from naturalizing their shorelines. But I would like to tell you that native plants are fun, they're exciting, and there is a lot of selection. You just need to go to the right place. And naturalization can really be a balance between maintaining wild spaces and using your property. And the more people that naturalize the property, the more comfortable other people will be doing it. So basically, in terms of naturalization, you can do anything with native plants that you can with ornamentals. So if you have bedrock and shallow soil, there's native plants that will work there. If you have shade, maybe you want some wild edibles, there's native plants for that. If you are concerned about erosion, there's shrubs specific to that. Maybe you want to plant a meadow, or for pollinators, or have a showy garden, and have, maybe you really like the color yellow and you want a lot of yellow in your garden. And those are all possibilities when you use native plants. So some of the things that you want to think about before planting, really want to think about where you use your property, what are the activities that you do, and where are areas that you don't use that you could restore and minimize some of the disturbance. And it's important to think about not just the structures that you have, but what you might have in the future. So maybe you want to put a gazebo in a couple of years. So those would be areas that you want to avoid naturalizing, and plan to have those structures there. Where your septic system is located is an important thing. Maybe you have some existing issues, whether it be erosion, maybe you have a geese problem. Do you have some drainage areas or wet areas? Because you would use different plants in those areas than you would in the others. Maybe you have some areas that you want to hide. Maybe you want to create some privacy between your neighbors and yourself. It's also important to think about what level of maintenance you want to do. Maybe you do want to do a little bit of gardening. And then while native plants are pretty much maintenance free, I do always recommend that people water them during their first year of life, just to really help them get established. And then you want to figure out how much you want to plant and the degree of effort. So some of your site conditions, once you figure out where you want to plant, you need to figure out what's there. And site conditions can change. You could have maybe 4 different site conditions on your property and more. So you want to think about your soil or the lack of soil. And then also your soil moisture. Is it dry? Is it average? Is it moist? Is it wet? How much sunlight do you receive? Because that's really going to dictate what plants you can plant in those areas. If you have a steep slope, you may want to look at putting in more shrubs. And then what existing plants are there? So even in a manicured space, there are often fringe areas with native plants. And the native plants that are in those fringe areas are really the plants that are going to do the best on your shoreline. So those are the ones that are good to plant or just to let grow in. So in terms of approach, there's nothing wrong with staging areas, especially if you have a big area to do, just picking one spot at a time. There's nothing wrong with planting a few things, seeing how they do, seeing what, how you like it, and then moving on to another area. With things like if you have a mowed lawn, just stopping mowing is its own form of naturalization, and that doesn't require any plantings or any extra time. So just stopping maintenance will allow the site to naturalize over time. It will just happen more slowly. In terms of site maintenance, if you do want to naturalize and you are currently maintaining that area, whether it be through whippersnipping or mowing or other things, you do want to maintain up until you plant, because it's much easier, for example, to plant into a lawn than it is to plant into long grass. If you have species like periwinkle or goutweed or things like that, you do want to remove them before you plant and make sure that they're gone, because they will outcompete a lot of the species that you put in. And then in terms of expectations, when we think about naturalization and shorelines, we might have a certain vision in mind, and it's a slower process. It takes longer to get there. So it might go through what a lot of us call the ugly stage. So it might be a stage that you really don't love the look of, but it will keep changing and evolving. And things are going to grow up that you never even knew was there. So just knowing that, getting into this. And then again, your ability to water and maintain your plants until they're well established. So I just wanted to share these photos with you just as we talk about site preparation and plant selection. So the photos, this is the same property. So the photos on the top are before, and the photos on the bottom are the after. So on the left side is a shoreline that was being maintained by mowing the grass. So the soil closer to the shoreline was quite moist, and then it got a little bit drier closer to the trees. So the bottom photo, what we did is we put in, they mowed the grass up until we planted, and then they stopped maintaining. The bottom photo on the left is what it looked like the following year. So it's not just, things coming up aren't just what we planted. That site is really starting to naturalize. And because it has a lot of sun, and because it has good soil moisture, it's starting to naturalize very quickly. Whereas the site on the right was heavy shade and it was dry sand. Very difficult to get plants established there. So what we did is we brought in compost, we planted into it, and then when the fall came, we made sure that they left the leaves on the ground, because basically in the shade you're trying to mimic a forest. So we're trying to bring that soil moisture back in. So this is it a year later. So that's just an example in terms of expectations. The site on the left is going to naturalize much more quickly than the site on the right. So this just helps you understand a little bit about how the process starts to look. So in terms of water level fluctuations, and with climate change, we are going to see more extreme water level fluctuations. Luckily, our native species are already adapted to this. When we look at river systems, they are already you know, the species growing there, they handle that flooding in the spring and then the water level dropping in the summer and the fall. So in naturalizing a shoreline, we really want to focus on a variety of shoreline species, you know, and look at that, try those, see what does best. There are some species that can handle flooding and drought, so things like blue vervain and common boneset, which are wildflowers, shrubs like meadowsweet. You can see them in a field and you can see them in a wetland. In terms of bedrock, so in Georgian Bay, lots of bedrock. So what plants are already present? What do you have at your site? And what you want to do is you want to look at pockets of soil that are in the cracks of the bedrock, and those are the places that you can start to plant if things aren't already growing there. And for that, I would focus on wildflowers and grasses. You could do shrubs as well, but you want to make sure they're small seedlings. So you can't really take something that has a really big pot or root ball and put that into a little pocket. So you're going to want to start smaller versus bigger. And then if you can, and if there's enough space in those pockets of soil, if you can add in some compost, that will just help maintain some soil moisture. And you're definitely going to want to water frequently after planting. So in terms of plant selection, I do want to share this with you. Now, this was developed for the Coalition of Haliburton Property Owners Association, but it is still relevant to here in Georgian Bay. Basically, what we wanted to do is we wanted to help people figure out what plants would work at their site if they knew their soil conditions. So if you just see there's soil type, sunlight, moisture, and location. So those check boxes help you determine what plants. So you enter those, and then it will tell you what plants would be suitable for your site. The other options are just things like, you know, maybe you want to plant something for birds or something that's drought resistant. So those are other options that you can add in. All of the species that we added in here are okay for Georgian Bay. They would grow here as well, and they're already found here. So what can you do if your property is already natural? So something to think about is, do you have multiple layers of vegetation? If you have mature trees, do you have small trees coming up to replace those mature trees? Can you reduce any runoff? Do you have the ability to increase any buffer between your activity and your natural areas? And then, as we've seen, especially with climate change, is there any opportunity for increasing plant diversity and habitat, such as putting in a brush pile, a bat house, a pollinator garden? In terms of pollinators, we have a minimum of 76 native species regionally that support pollinators. And I like to use the word support and not attract, because pollinators need food and habitat from early spring all the way to late fall. So thinking about what to plant for them through that whole season. And it doesn't have to be in one specific garden. It can be spread out around your property. So for example, on our farm, we have willows. We have a wetland. So we have willows in the wetland, and that's actually the earliest source of food for pollinators. And then we have some things like wildflowers up in the field. So it's sort of spread out in terms of a larger area. And we want to think about too that pollinators also include things like bats, birds, and small mammals. So in terms of native plant sourcing, I'm a big advocate for supporting local businesses, but when it comes to naturalization and getting native plant nurseries are really the best to deal with. Many start plants they go out, they collect the seed from wild areas, they're ethically collected, and they're started from seed, which means that you're increasing that genetic diversity, which is going to help us as climate change progresses. They also have the best variety and a good supply, and their staff is very knowledgeable in terms of those plants. The only thing that you still need to keep in mind is that a lot of our native plant nurseries are in Southern Ontario, so we need to think about which plants work here regionally, because they would have a bigger variety than what we would plant here. And most of them, for example, Grow Wild. I've worked with Grow Wild and Omimi for years. They do not use any pesticides because they're small. They're in general, they're small nurseries, and they're dealing directly with native plant stock. Ontario Native Plants is online only. They ship via Canada Post. There's native plants in Claremont. And then for things like shrubs and trees, Not So Hollow Farm in Barrie, and Verbindens Nursery in Dundas has a really nice selection. So in terms of climate change, we really need to start shifting our perceptions and shifting as to what we actually find beautiful and what we want to see on our property, really shifting from land ownership to land stewardship. So here we are in the fall, and we have an opportunity to do a little bit of habitat improvement. So instead of cleaning up your garden in the fall, it's better to delay your garden cleanup to the spring. So things like seed heads are a source for food for songbirds. Our solitary native bees, they overwinter in things like leaves and twigs and bark. So we want to leave that there for them for the winter. So you do your garden cleanup in the spring after several days of 10 degrees Celsius, because that will give pollinators time to sort of wake up. And then also avoiding any chemicals. So this includes things like mosquito sprays. Thank you so much for having me today, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Julia. I was really intrigued by that website that you shared, the CHA website, for the resource about which plants to choose. And I think, yeah, that's a great resource, and I'll make sure that that's circulated around with everyone participating today. So we do have a few questions in the question and answer tool. Again, just before we jump into questions, if you have one in mind, I just ask you that, again, put your questions in that tool, and we'll get to them. So our first question, Julia, is we have a cottage on a small lake. When trees fall into the lake, should we be trying to remove them or leave them in place?
That's a great question. I usually say that if they're not a safety issue, I would leave them, because it's great fish habitat and it's great habitat for aquatic insects. So again, if it's not causing a safety issue for boating or other sort of activities, I would leave them. Okay.
Our next question is, can wood chips also work for another root ball or another method instead of compost?
Wood chips will work. I would still use, you don't want to plant a plant in wood chips. You can mulch with wood chips. That's really great because it actually increases the fungal activity in the soil, which is a huge help to the plant. But the plants definitely need some sort of more of a dirt-like substance to be planted into. So I would actually using both, but you want to make sure that the roots have the dirt and the top part has the wood chips, or if there is wood chips mixed in, you want to make sure that they're fairly well broken down. Even planting and then leaving things like twigs and branches on top of the soil, they will break down over time and help with the fungal activity as well. When it comes to compost, I don't use things like manure or fertilizer, especially on shorelines, but compost is usually fairly well broken down, and the main reason for using that is soil moisture, but also it does have more nutrients that are more readily available. It would take the wood chips longer to provide those nutrients because they aren't as composted.
Okay, thank you. The next question, is there a way to naturalize, say, a path down to the shoreline? Let's say, you have a dock on the edge of your shoreline, and someone was to, again, put that natural buffer in there. Is there a way to naturalize a path, essentially, or what is?
I think that the best thing with a path, so the path, you can go a couple of ways. So one could be using wood chips, actually, so natural wood mulch, and making it fairly thick, because when the water hits the wood is rough, so it will slow down and help the water infiltrate into the soil. So wood chips are actually a great option. The other thing that you can do is, now the only thing is it's not native. Some people will use white clover because white clover, you don't need to mow it and it stays low. The only thing is if it's sunny overall, the white clover could spread. And white clover is, it's not as much of an issue in terms of its impact. The other thing that you could do is look at some native ground covers, so things that grow really low, something like bunchberry. Those ones can grow and handle a little bit of traffic. If you're walking on it a lot, then you'll probably get some bare patches of dirt, but maybe doing a mix of that and some wood chips. So looking at something like a native ground cover. And again, that's going to depend on, that will depend a little bit on how much sunlight you have and slope and things like that.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is, are there any recommended plants for the septic bed in particular, other than grass?
Yes, so that's, it's a smaller selection, but there are wildflowers that are completely fine for your septic system. Your septic operator may tell you no, but there are plants, they're shallow rooted and they're not going to interfere with your tile bed. You can approach it in a different way, in a couple of ways. You could start some things, you could get some seedlings, so actually coming in a plug, but there's a place called the Wildflower Farm in Aurelia, and they sell wildflower seed that is specific for septic systems. So the one thing that you do want to do though is with the septic, you want to make sure that if you are going to plant wildflowers, you kind of need to start from scratch. So when you first develop your septic, or you need to remove what's there before you put that on top. And doing it by seed will be more maintenance heavy than adding in other plants. So I don't have the list off the top of my head, but things like wild columbine, wild bergamot, sweet oxeye, those are 3 species off the top of my head that would be fine there, but there are specific lists.
Okay, thank you. Maybe a similar type of question. Our next one is referring to bank stability. So in the instances where some rather severe shoreline erosion has occurred, is there any species that are best to plant in those type of situations, or other methods of naturalization that works best for those very steep and already eroded areas?
So there are, there's definitely species that are better for erosion. So red osier dogwood, anything in the dogwood or the willow family, those are unique in that with willows and dogwoods, basically along they have strong root systems, but also anywhere along their branch, if that branch touches the soil, it will form roots. So you can make actually networks of, so instead of having one root ball, you can make a network of roots using these species. So not only can you plant them, but you can make structures out of them. And this is called bioengineering. Basically what you do, you can make different types of structures. So there's something called a fascine, which is you're using the dormant branches of willows and dogwoods. So you're cutting them or you're getting them in sort of November or very early spring before they start to sprout. And you're basically, with the fascine, you're making a tube. So it's basically, and you want to stuff the branches together and really tangle them. So you're making a long tube, however long you need it, and then tying it together with twine. And then you can use that on the shoreline horizontally, or you can also use it if you have some gully erosion that's happening, sort of from the upland areas down to the water. You can use that vertically as well. And you want to dig a little bit of a trench, stuff it in there, and then you need to bury it partially with soil so that part of it's covered in soil and part of it can receive the sunlight. So the part that's in the sun will sprout, but then you create this whole network of roots. and the thing about these structures is even if they don't sprout or have a lot of growth, that roughness, those structures that you create are rough, so it slows water down. And then there's also brush mattresses, so that's sort of a fan shaped, doing that along the shoreline. So if you look up fascines and brush mattresses, you should be able to find at least some photos on the internet and some good sources. There are also things made out of coir. So coir logs. So coir is coconut fabric, and it's logs are basically rolls, so tubes. So again, if you're experiencing some erosion, using those logs to protect sort of where that water level is that's sort of aggravating the soil, and then planting above it. The other thing that they have are coir mats. So if you had to do a planting, but you're worried about bare soil washing into the water, or you have an area that's being eroded, you can add soil in, cover it, and stake it in with the coir mat, and then plant into that coir. So the coir will biodegrade over time because it's just coconut husks. And then by that time, the plants will have established to secure the site. All of these things, technically within the high water mark, require permitting, and you definitely want to do your research before just starting with bioengineering, but definitely willows and dogwoods for those. Other species like the viburnum family and also the alder family, they're also very good for erosion.
Thank you. Those sound like some really good alternatives to those brick and stone barricades that you had shown earlier. Great. So if there's any more questions, we still have a little bit more time. I'll just leave the question box open for another minute or so. And if there's any final questions, we can take those. So I'll give everyone a minute or so. The next question that just came in is it possible to access your PowerPoint for review? The answer to that is yes. This webinar has been recorded and it will be made available on GBBR's, the Georgian Bay Biosphere's YouTube channel, and we will be circulating a link out to access that video.
Maybe while we're just waiting to see if there's any more questions coming in, the Coalition of Halliburton Property Owners Association, where that native plant database is, they also have a lot of resources there. Because of the Love Your Lake study, they've really focused on two things: one, properly functioning septic systems, and two, natural shorelines. So they have some good resources generally on their website as well. So if you're checking out the native plant database, there's lots of other things there, and I think they have instructions on how to figure out what soil type you have if you're not familiar with figuring out which types you've got.
And Julia, we can coordinate and provide some links to those resources in addition to that YouTube video.
Great.
So I'm not seeing any more questions come in at the moment. So with that, I just wanted to, again, thank everyone for joining us here today for this webinar, and thank Julia for the excellent and informative presentation. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.